Climate activists are celebrating a major win at Europe's top human rights court with a verdict that could have implications across the continent and around the world. More than 2,000 women, most in their 70s, had argued the Swiss government had failed to adequately protect them from the effects of climate change. They claimed their health and quality of life was undermined because their age and gender had made them particularly vulnerable to heat waves.
There has been a violation of Article 8 of the Convention.
We can be very proud, us the members of Senior Women for Climate, to have brought for the first time to court climate and fundamental rights. And the court recognised our fundamental right to a healthy climate and to have our country do what it failed to do until now. That is to say, taking ambitious measures to protect our health and protect the future of all.
The women launched their case 9 years ago. Initially, the group had 40 members, and it now has more than 2,500. The women had their case dismissed in Switzerland's federal court in 2020. That's when they decided to take the matter to the top court in Strasbourg.
I am so, shocked, positively shocked, so happy, because we could do something. We could do something. We could contribute to the future, to a better future for our children.
The European Climate Agency has confirmed that last month was Earth's hottest March yet. It's the 10th straight record month of high temperatures. Climate charts reveal Switzerland is warming at more than 2 times the global average. Its glaciers are melting at a rapid rate. The government says it takes serious note of the court's verdict.
We will carefully analyse the content of this judgment, which is extremely detailed. We will try and identify in due course with all the authorities concerned at the domestic level which measures can and should be proposed to try and address the finding of a violation that the court has issued in this ruling.
The ruling cannot be challenged, but the European Rights Court, which has jurisdiction over 46 countries, has rejected 2 other climate cases, including one by a mayor against the French government. The other was brought by a group of young people in Portugal who sought to force 32 European governments to take action to reduce greenhouse gases.
We didn't break the wall, we made a huge crack. I want to see the win against Switzerland being used against all European countries and in national courts. All governments in Europe must act on this ruling immediately. And now we need people all around Europe to come together to make sure their countries do this.
Nikki Reich is the Director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Centre for International Environmental Law, and she joins us now from Oakland. Hi, Nikki. We've seen those celebrations outside the court. How significant is this win?
Well, we really can't overstate how significant and historic the landmark ruling from the European Court was. It is the first international court to rule on the inadequacy of a state's climate action under human rights law. So it is a landmark precedent in that regard. And the court's judgment really left no question. It found clearly that the failure of Switzerland to take urgent and effective measures to combat climate change violates human rights and violates the state's obligations, its legal obligations under human rights law. And that is a critical first that will have impacts not only in Switzerland, where the judgment is immediately binding and takes effect, but on the rest of the countries in Europe subject to those same legal obligations, and indeed on countries around the world as courts look to this opinion to guide their own interpretations of what legal obligations are in the face of the climate crisis.
Yeah, it seems like one thing that stands out about this case is that it's a group of older women. We see a lot of cases brought by young people talking about future generations. We've seen Pacific Island communities who are on the front lines of climate change. But this case is a bit different. I mean, heat waves on older people, I guess it shows a real diversification in who can bring an action and the kinds of things those actions can be about.
I think that's right, in that it really underscores that climate change is an intersectional crisis. It's a human rights crisis, and that has impacts across swaths of the population, and it impacts different groups that are in vulnerable situations, be they elderly people or youth. And those impacts are compounded when different identities intersect. And so when people are in poverty or in marginalized situations, those impacts are more severe. But what this case really underscores is that climate change is having human rights impacts today in the present. It's not a future risk. It's real now for both present and future generations. And I think it represents the courage of these claimants who have come out uniting across generations to really demand a livable future for all.
And you've mentioned human rights a few times there. I mean, are we seeing a bit of a pivot in the way that climate change is understood, being reframed as a human rights issue rather than just an environmental one?
Well, this decision really leaves no doubt that the climate crisis is a human rights crisis that is impacting and infringing on human rights, that gives rise to human rights claims under human rights law and human rights obligations. So that is perhaps one of the most indelible impacts, is that it cements that understanding, drawing on unequivocal, really undeniable science around the causes and consequences of climate change to make clear that the climate crisis is a human rights crisis and it is appropriately dealt with under human rights law and by human rights courts. And that will have implications for the many climate cases that are pending before national courts around the world. But it also helps reinforce and vindicate the claims of those on the front lines of the climate crisis, like the Pacific Islanders, whom you mentioned, who have brought claims seeking to hold governments accountable for failing to protect their rights in the face of devastating climate impacts that are only mounting. So that outcome is incredibly significant and will hopefully have implications for other courts that are right now considering, like the International Court of Justice, that will be coming out with an opinion about what international law requires of states in the face of the climate crisis. And this decision makes crystal clear that human rights law speaks to that question, that there are human rights law obligations to take urgent and effective action to protect people from environmental harm like the climate crisis.
And obviously, seeing a successful action is very exciting for legal teams around the world. We are seeing sort of this rising tide of climate change litigation. Do you think this will spur on more and more cases to be brought forward? Will this continue to snowball?
I think the tide of litigation really is unstoppable. There are climate cases pending and forthcoming around the world. And this will indeed, I think, give more impetus for those who seek to defend and vindicate the rights of people who are suffering increasing harm as the climate crisis escalates. I think, because the ruling is not only important for Switzerland, to which it speaks directly, but for all the countries across Europe, those countries need to now look to see if their policies are adequate to meet their human rights obligations, and where they aren't, to urgently ratchet them up or face legal consequences. So this not only will I think, encourage and add impetus to the pressure, the climate justice movement through litigation and other advocacy to urge states to act, but will also give some comfort to and embolden other courts around the world to make rulings under human rights law to recognize that human rights are at stake and that states have duties to protect those rights by taking effective action to mitigate the causes of climate change immediately in the near term, and to do so at a pace that has a chance of preventing devastating and irreversible harm.
Nikki Reich from the Centre for International Environmental Law, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you so much.